Welcome to webinar 5, which is effective questioning, active learning and reviewing and connecting the learning. As we can continue to consider what will have an impact on children's learning, we return to features of highly effective practice and in particular effective questioning. Effective questioning is an area that in lots of cases does require some attention, some refocus, and some careful planning, mostly because of the high return that we know that we will get from effective questioning. More importantly, through class discussion, which is, if you remember from our effect sizes chart, came in at 0.82, so a very, very credible consideration when we consider how to accelerate children's learning. Effective questioning is a key area to improving children's learning. And of course it features and overlaps in so many other areas in terms of learning intention, success criteria, also in feedback, which we will go on in a subsequent webinar to come. But we know as well in this webinar, when we look at active learning and we look at how children's retention rate can be increased by 50% more if they're involved in that high quality discussion, and that can only come from effective questioning that, as we see, is well planned, well considered and well structured within a lesson. We all had a bit of a giggle at the beginning of our webinar pre-discussion, where we had a look at the donkey pick me slide, and I think part of our giggle was that we have all fallen foul of this. We have all relied on that one child to give us the answer to the questions that we're looking for, and it is so tempting.
Oh, pick me! Oh, I know, me!
And it genuinely is so tempting to rely on that one child or that group of children to give us that reaffirmation that we're looking for, to give us the answers that we're perhaps desperately looking for. But in actual fact, a piece of research conducted by Robert Powell, one of the recommended readers that we will suggest after this webinar, on learning by questioning, is that we can't rely on this a handful of those children. We can't rely on the donkey that's with their hand up in the air, that we will not gather the reliable assessment on learning, and that the distribution of contribution is way out of balance. It's way out of kilter when we do that. And that piece of research is a really credible one. And one of the ways that we know that we can encourage all learners to contribute is by the use of lollipop sticks, and something advocated by Dylan Williams. But it has been a great topic of debate within IOC, so we've included it as part of our post-webinar discussion to gather thoughts and opinions on lollipop sticks, because lollipop sticks are not popular with children like Donkey, where they don't dominate the discussion and they don't dominate the chat and they don't dominate the teacher's attention, where it is spread more evenly. And of course there is that there's no hiding, there's no place to hide when the lollipop sticks are out. So it is a way to ensure that we have that distribution of contribution, but again, something that we would like to open up for debate amongst us all as part of our post-webinar discussion. So in considering Powell's research, we use this illustration to try and depict what his research tells us about questioning in a typical classroom. His research is based on a number of studies across a number of classrooms, and where he observes in a classroom and has a a very simplistic method in doing this, but it's a very powerful message that he concludes, because it's literally just a classroom like this with circles depicting the children that are sitting there, and it's just to gauge how many individuals had actually contributed to the lesson in terms of the questions being asked and answered. And what he found was there was a vast majority of a cluster of 5 or 6 children, and he just literally would tick when that child would answer the question. So in this case, we've got a little star above the head of that particular child that contributed to that lesson or was asked a question. So there's this cluster of 5 or 6 that will have multiple ticks or stars, if you like, that have contributed more than once, more than twice, 5 or 6 times to the conversation. Now, there will be a number of children, again around that same number, about 5 or 6 children, who will contribute just perhaps once, just a single contribution. And for a teacher, perhaps initially you look at that and you say, well, do you know, look around my class, yep, there's lots of children answering out, speaking up, and it does look like a fairly well engaged class that are speaking up and speaking out. But when he looked closer, what he then saw was a number of children. You can see the number of children here who actually contributed nothing, and for all intent and purposes were not engaged. Perhaps they were, but we don't know, because they didn't have a voice, we didn't hear their opinions, we didn't give them an opportunity to reassure us that they were engaged, or in fact they were still with us on their learning journey, and we hadn't left them behind. So how he puts this in the analogy is a good analogy. I like the analogy, because what he'll say is we've got our donkeys, our pick me, we've got our volunteers, and you can see our volunteers here. They've answered out at least 2 or 3 times. Yep, they're volunteers, they want to contribute. The children sitting here that have maybe only answered once, that is our conscripts. So the analogy around that is that they are answering out only when they really need to, only when they've been asked. And then for the rest of the children, well, I added this to his analogy. They're the deserters. They are the ones that just do not want to be engaged. They are just trying to get out of there. They're just biding their time till they manage to get out of that nice wee door there on the right-hand side and leave that lesson. So his research suggests to us that this is a very typical scenario in lots of our classrooms. So again, we have to ask you to be honest. We have to ask you to be reflective and say, is this typical of your classroom? If this kind of research was to be conducted within your classroom, are you that teacher that when you do get a visit to your classroom, you're relying on donkey, you're relying on the volunteers, and that the conscripts are not so there, and your deserters are under the table, taking nothing to do with anything? And again, when we do start to reflect and self-evaluate on the environment that we're creating in our classrooms, then I think we can truly be reflective and start to then make those improvements that we're asking you to make in IOC, to asking you to do those things differently in your practice that will make the difference to the teaching and learning in your classroom. As part of our pre-webinar discussion, we asked you to consider the average wait time that a teacher would allow before moving on from a question or asking a different question. And of course, the answers are always extremely interesting. But here's some more very interesting facts, that teachers in actual fact can ask up to 2 questions every minute, which can equate to 400 in a day, 70,000 in a year, or 2 to 3 million in the course of a career. Now, wouldn't we like all to have £1 for every question that we asked then in this case? But in all seriousness, the amount of time that we allow children to think, to consider, to process a question, it is cause for concern. The average waiting time is 0.9 seconds. Not even 1 second do we allow before we move on, we rephrase, we redirect questions. Okay, no, you don't know? Okay, so I'll ask a different way, I'll ask it to a different person. And children are hijacked. They're sitting not able to give that response because there's not been sufficient waiting time, thinking time for that to happen. Even if we allowed for 3 seconds more, that effect would have significant difference on children's ability to process the question and to consider the question and to formulate an answer. If they were given the luxury of anything between 10 and 15 seconds, that would allow them to explore even more ideas. It would allow them opportunities to choose to either externalize it and talk it through with a thinking partner or a shoulder partner, or in some cases even to internalize, to understand it and to process it. And if, my goodness, if they were allowed the luxury of a 2-minute thinking time or a 2-minute opportunity to discuss it, this fosters skills in terms of challenge, it fosters skills in terms of analysis, and it fosters skills in terms of how children can evaluate the questions that you're asking them. So in actual fact, something that we do fundamentally wrong when we ask questions, so regardless of how they've been formulated, they become ineffective because we don't allow for that time. And just look at the number of questions we ask in our career. And again, we're saying questions. We're not saying that they're effective questions. We're saying questions can account up to a third of our teaching time. So look at that majority of time where we are questioning children, only second to the time devoted to explanation. And of course, we all love a good explanation to our class. But note again, it's not effective questioning. That's what's omitted here, is the fact that none of these things are necessarily effective. And if we are remiss in allowing that thinking time in its simplest form, not allowing that to happen, then it renders the questions to be ineffective. And we take our guidance here from the Learning and Teaching Strategy for Curriculum for Excellence, and it says questioning is at the heart of an effective learning environment. A good questioning climate is one that activates understanding and thinking and focuses on the development of learning, and that is absolutely fundamentally what we want for our children. But what we are very guilty of is not creating that learning environment. And if we don't create that learning environment, or we don't give the children that climate where there is opportunities to question and to be asked questions, to ask questions of each other and to ask questions of you, the teacher, then we will not get these real deep understanding skills and thinking that can focus on their learning. And unfortunately, again, our pre-webinar activity suggested that there is a distinct difference between the type of questions that we are asking, and we have to foster that environment within our classrooms. And if we rely on those closed questions or those lower order questions, then in actual what we're doing is we are not allowing children to participate effectively in their learning. If the culture is and the climate is that that's okay and that's allowed to happen, like the research that Powell did, that there's those deserters or just those conscripts, then in actual fact we are not providing equity within our classroom. We are not providing children opportunities to get smarter, to engage in learning. And if those children don't take those opportunities and we do nothing about it, then we will therefore create an environment which is one of inequality, because the children, those volunteers who do participate, who do take up those opportunities, they will have all of these rich learning experiences here where they can develop understanding and thinking, and focuses on developing their learning, and that they will actually accelerate in their learning, and they will achieve more. They will become smarter, as Dylan Williams says. They will become smarter because they are those volunteers taking up that challenge. But in actual fact, if we don't create that environment within our classroom, then that gap will widen. The achievement gap will widen, and we will not create that opportunity for all children to learn. Some children, therefore, are conscripts or our deserters, will in actual fact stagnate, or in actual fact regress in their learning. So this quote in particular is very poignant, and something for us to truly reflect upon, that we must create that learning environment, and we must have that good questioning climate within our classrooms. And reflecting on, albeit Donkey, Pick Me, and on Powell's research, it's the first port of call where we start to reflect on that climate and that environment that we have within our classrooms. As always, we return and make our links back to our curriculum and to the very fundamental elements of our curriculum, which is our 4 capacities. And again, we are given guidance, we are given the key messages around what these entitlements are for our children, and again, everything links to these. Everything that we are suggesting to you that's highly effective practice actually links back to these 4 capacities for learning. So from here, we're talking about transferable skills that will enable them to become lifelong learners. So those skills that we are asking them to develop is a back to that equity again, equity of opportunity within your classroom. So those skills that we are developing in terms of the questioning, in terms of them being able to think critically and analyse and evaluate, are skills for life. So when we do use effective questioning, it is absolutely supporting them on their learning journey. And again, that has to be an equitable journey. It has to be a journey where they're equipped for that lifelong learning, and that those skills are actually transferable, and that can come absolutely from effective questioning within the classroom, so that we are developing these 4 capacities within our children. So of course now, as we say, we will always refer you back to How Good Is Our School For, our Bible. And you can see here under 2.3, Learning, Teaching and Assessment, that there is, under the quality of teaching, there's an absolute definitive reference here to skilled questioning to promote that curiosity, independence and confidence, and the specific mention of higher order thinking skills. So we're resurrecting HOTS again. We're saying it has to be part of your planning. We mentioned it as part of success criteria. We're saying again here, here's where you can formulate effective questioning when you look at the HOTS thinking skills. There's some features of highly effective practice to be considered as part of 2.3. There's also these challenge questions. So ask yourself, are you using those HOTS thinking skills in your questioning strategies? Are you enabling them to become independent learners through the 4 capacities as we've just considered? And again, linked to Louise's presentation on active learning, when children do show you that they are those independent learners transferring those skills. And again, are we considering a range of valid, reliable and relevant assessment tools? Because that's what effective questioning is. It's an assessment tool, but are we using a range of effective questions? And that's something we're going to go on and consider. Just what are our questions? How are they supporting that reliable and relevant assessment tool that we're asking, so that we know that we're improving children's and young people's learning? Okay, so Dylan Williams, a very, very well quoted and well respected man in terms of all things formative assessment and features of highly effective questioning and all of it highly effective practice. And a very important quote there from him is that it's actually one of the most significant things that we can do. I would say, though, probably one of the things that we plan least in our day-to-day teaching is questions. And as part of my observations, as part of, I've visited many classrooms over the years, it is very apparent that questions have not been planned, that they've not been used to take that opportunity to be one of the most important things that we can do within the classroom to improve the quality of teaching and learning. So the question is, why do we ask questions? But I would say, why do we ask questions? Why do we not ask high quality questions? It's not about why do we, it's about do we ask high quality questions rather than why do we ask questions. So do we ask high quality questions is perhaps the better question to pose to you just now as you consider and reflect. But in answer to this question, Dylan Williams would say, well, we ask questions for two specific reasons, believe it or not, two specific reasons, and they are quite clear, but yet open up a whole different self-evaluation, self-reflection when we consider them in their two forms, and it actually then makes us think, just like we did in our pre-webinar, it makes us think about when we're using the different types of question and are we using them effectively? Are they high quality questions that are used all of the time? Okay, so here are the two questions that we ask. We ask questions either to collect evidence or to cause learners to think. What we have to be very aware of is what type of questions we're asking and why and for what purpose, and so that there's not an over-reliance on one particular type. So we'll begin to explore the two different types of questions, the two reasons that we ask questions, and then start to explore how we use them more effectively. So this collecting of evidence is about what pupils already know. It's very important. It absolutely is. We must know. And again, back to that knowledge and understanding, back to our learning intentions, we need to identify the gaps. We need to know what it is that the children don't know. And that could be the question around activating prior knowledge. Is that the questions that we're asking at the point where we need to identify those gaps? Is it the questions where we find and try and close the gap? What is it that we need the goals are from that? And also, how do we scaffold? What is it, the evidence that we're trying to gather here is what is it these children need to develop their understanding? And those questions can be a very low level or lower order, or can be very closed. They can be very closed questions, and we'll explore that a wee bit further. However, the other forms of questions that we can ask is when it is perhaps deeper learning, where it's more considered because we're asking children to think, we're causing them to think, and that's that environment that that we're trying to create when we want children to be able to think deeper, to evaluate, and so on. And you can start to see the language of HOTS emerging here, making thinking visible again. A whole philosophy around that about how we make children's thinking visible. So that's for the teacher, the class, and themselves, so that everything is discussed and is transparent, and we can see what it is that the thinking is, and we model it, and we give examples, and the children are very aware of that. Questions that allow the teacher to identify misconceptions and then perhaps address them through those highly effective questions will again engage learners, because it dispels those myths, it gets rid of those insecurities, it supports self-esteem, it supports confidence. And these kind of questions where questioning causes thinking, promotes learning, as we see, new learning, is vital for assessment. It's vital for the assessment of the learning, because we want that to be new learning. And those situations where I said where children are stagnant, there's no new learning. And if there's an over-reliance on just collecting that evidence, that's just recall. And we'll go on and address that a wee bit more when we look closer at the different types of questioning. But certainly what we want to do is to provide children with the next steps, questions that provide the next steps. It is explicit to the children what it is that they need to do. And again, that's just back to your success criteria again, where you are giving children the next steps. We'll go on and at subsequent webinars about feedback. Again, that's about next steps and in making sure that children are continually progressing and that they're experiencing achievement through that next steps feedback. And it's the questioning that supports all of that. So, as alluded to, there are different types of questions that do promote learning, but what we have to be very aware of is to get that balance, because we now know that we're asking questions for two specific reasons. One is very lower order skills, lower order questions. So it's about recall, which are closed questions also. Again, explore that a wee bit further. And the kind of remembering, showing the understanding, is when we have to collect that evidence around children's learning. What we must do to make those questions highly effective is, yes, at times, absolutely, those are essential and they're required. However, we have to create opportunities, that environment that we're talking about, to progress children's learning and to make sure all children are engaged as in these open questions or in these higher order questions that we know, and that hierarchy that we have from HOTS. Okay, so first of all, we will look at the closed questions and the lower order questions, and you'll know us again from the pre-webinar activity that it can be very frustrating when it is typically just yes/no answers. Now, they are effective and they do have a place when you just want that specific feedback and quickly and efficiently to the point. But there can't be an over-reliance on that. And Dylan Williams attributes that to a game of ping pong, where it's literally just, I ask you a question, you respond, I give you a response back. It's just between me and you, ping pong back and forth, and it's those yes/no answers. And that again can be a trap that we can fall into when we're asking questions. So we have to then accept, yes, that they are very, very appropriate to check factual understanding and that recall, but they are lower order questions. And again, that's the recall, it's the remembering, or maybe some elements of the understanding. But there are many disadvantages. Although they're really, really good for testing knowledge, there are many disadvantages, because when it's a yes/no, it's a 50-50. There's a chance that that child can give you the wrong answer and not actually understanding the question or not really understanding the piece of learning they've just been involved in. So there are many disadvantages to them, but as long as we're aware of what their purpose can be, when to use them, and not have an over-reliance on them, then yes, they give us that information that we're looking for, that evidence that we're gathering, but we have to have that real balance of open and closed questions. So now we consider our open questions, and that's that making thinking visible. It's engaging children in thinking. And this is absolutely, just allows the learners to bring a little bit of themselves to the question. It allows them to demonstrate an understanding because the questions are provoking more from them, if you like, evoking more from them, and really asking for that deeper response. And this is a real key to choosing this type of questioning. And I think it gives the learner an opportunity to discover that about themselves, to discover what it is that they do know, discover more what their misconceptions were, or that their understanding were, when we do ask these open questions. And they absolutely are higher order thinking skills questions. And these tend to be, as we've already alluded to, where your success criteria is supported is through these higher order thinking skills. And absolutely, in true form, would support your learning intention. So the outcome of the learning is very, very clear and supported by these open questions that we're asking. And some of the questions that just make the difference, and again, the analogy, sporting analogy that Dylan Williams uses the ping pong with the closed questions, but with the basketball game here with the open questions, and it's almost, it goes around the class. So the question is not one-on-one, it's, yeah, a question is asked, a response is given, it's passed on to another member of the class. What makes you say that? Could you say more about that? So you're passing it around the class with these kind of questions that enhance skills, their attributes to be able to answer these questions, their capabilities to think, that visible thinking, to think that bit deeper. So these opportunities have to be well planned and well considered. And that type of questions that you ask will ensure that those kind of skills are being developed within the children. So all very familiar with the higher order thinking skills, but again, it is hierarchical and it's important for us to do that. But again, we're absolutely advocating that these be resurrected and to support your success criteria, to support your effective questioning within your classroom. Be aware of the importance of using these questions at specific times, and also when it's relevant and important to use those higher order thinking skills when we're asking children to think deeply or demonstrate their understanding or skills in a different way. And this again gives you the evidence of that deep learning or of that secure learning. And again, using these in a variety of ways encourages you to formulate more effective questioning and encourages the children to develop all of these skills that we're asking them to develop. Okay, so rather than a list of do's and don'ts, we've just reflect now on what we have covered up until now in terms of effective questioning. So ensure that there's a fair distribution of contribution. Okay, so that research that Powell did, consider that in your own classroom. Don't rely on the pick me. Consider the lollipop sticks and the roles that they will have, and also that thinking time. Not the 0.9 seconds, that is the average wait time. Consider that, consider the amount of time that you allow children to consider and reflect on the question that you've asked, but also opportunities for them to do that collaboratively with their shoulder partner, with their thinking partner. Planning is key. Planning is key, and again, something that is not necessarily always evident is that there's been good planning for questions, and that there's been careful planning around the timing of questions. Never mind the range, open, closed, higher, lower, the timing of it, at what time, and its success criteria at regular points within the lesson, but these have to be carefully planned. Questions should be presented in a range of style to develop that critical thinking, and part of a future webinar around metacognition will pick this up in terms of where we can develop those children thinking about their thinking and reflecting, and some of the practice that we'll share with you is around strategies like retrieval or jigsaw or solo taxonomy, and things like this that will just make children a wee bit more engaged in their critical thinking of their learning. Of course, activating prior knowledge is key, so questioning must support that. Those questions must be well formulated, and that could be your closed questions and your lower order questions in there to identify those gaps and misconceptions. Questions should be about, and this is a careful consideration, because more often than not, it can be the way that there's a question in the teacher's head and the children are trying to guess, just like the Walt and the Wolf, where, you know, what I'm looking for. Children are desperately trying to guess what it is the teacher's saying, and that can have a real impact on self-confidence. So when it is an incorrect response, consider how you deal with that. Is it like, nope, move on, nope, next, who, nope, 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 and again, we've seen that, and again that would really knock confidence and self-esteem, and those children become the deserters, and at very most would be the conscripts, but that you could see how it would not, absolutely not raise the level of challenge. And we'll look at feedback, we'll explore that a wee bit further about the decisions children make when they get that kind of feedback. And if our questioning is not supporting that, then we have to consider what it is that we're doing there. So please do consider that carefully. And again, linking to Elsa's input that she's going to give you, questioning has to be key when we're reviewing and connecting that learning, and all of this will play its part absolutely when we're considering reviewing and connecting the learning, to ensure that children are continuing to achieve and attain. A particularly effective questioning style is the hinge point questioning, and you'll have watched Dylan Williams' video on that. And if it's something that you're not familiar with, then certainly something I hope you would consider, because it is highly effective. And we were talking about those times where you should plan your question. This would be very important to be well planned and at a point in the lesson where you will make decisions based on the responses that you get from the children when you ask these hinge point questions. So there's a couple of examples here. Now, what's key to hinge point questioning is that you can use a variety of approaches: multiple choice, more than correct answer. It can be the all learner response. It's important you get feedback from all of the children. There's clickers and so on, and those kind of things will give you that immediate response that you're looking for. But what's important is when you formulate this, it's got to be that the children can't get it wrong or can't get it right for the wrong reasons. So the questions that you're asking are absolutely watertight. And there's a few examples here, as I say, but it's got to address misconceptions. It's got to give you that immediate kind of feedback. For example, that the children know what a verb is. Yep, I've got it from this hinge point question. The children know what alliteration is. Yeah, so that can't be, that hinge point question can't come too late to the party. It can't come at the point where you've already done so much work and you've asked them to do a piece of writing using alliteration or so on. So the planning of that has to be carefully considered. And again, it has to be something that's an all learner response, so that you've got that immediate feedback. So it could be the ABCD cards, or it could be the QR codes and so on. And there's there's lots of kind of technology now out there that gives us that kind of feedback that we're looking for. But something that's well worth considering, I'm going to ask you as part of your post-webinar task, is to consider a lesson that you've done previously where you perhaps didn't have a hinge point question, but you would now consider where that would be an appropriate point to put in that that lesson, to include in that lesson, and that'd be a trio task that you can work on together. So finally, to conclude, what will contribute to effective questioning is a very well planned, carefully thought out and considered approach to questioning within your lessons, considering hinge point questions, but considering those opportunities where it's appropriate for closed, for open, for higher order and lower order thinking skills. And this is just a grid that perhaps can support you with that, and something that you can refer back to. So I'm going to hand you now to Louise, and you'll see some of this come alive, to come into fruition as part of the active learning that we ask you to engage your children in.
Thank you, Geraldine. We're now going to move on to active learning, and hopefully you'll now be seeing how we need all of these pieces of the jigsaw puzzle to fit together to make sure that we are providing the highest quality learning and teaching to be able to raise attainment and achievement in our classrooms. Before we start, it's really important that we understand what we mean by active learning and developing active learners. A common perception of active learning for a long time was that it was based on physical activity. So the learners had to be up and moving around and making or doing things. But I think we're getting much better at our understanding of this now, and we know that active learning is about making the brain active and not the person. So a much more broad view is if children are active, they're engaged in their learning through thinking, imagining, discussing and evaluating. It's not about a complete change to your classroom practice. It's about thinking about how your children learn. And active learning is at the heart of Curriculum for Excellence, and it's a really effective way for children to develop skills and knowledge and enjoy learning, take that ownership of learning and have a positive attitude to learning, which they can take on to later life and have that really coherent, smooth transition from 3 to 18 in that journey that they have of learning. Well, active learning allows learners to be much more actively involved in their own learning and teachers to take on a more guided role. However, it's not about reducing the role of the teacher, as skillful planning is so important. You as teachers need to consider the outcome of activities and how you're going to assess progress and impact. So it's about you very, very carefully planning what you're doing to ensure children have that ownership of learning, which will lead to a deeper level of skills development, knowledge and understanding. We've already looked at Building the Curriculum 3, a framework for learning and teaching, and we're going to stay with the Building the Curriculum series today and have a look at Building the Curriculum 2, active learning in the early years. And it's really important that we read and we remember to look at this series of documents because they really do show us the key features that make Curriculum for Excellence a reality. And we really do need to work hard to provide the highest quality of learning and teaching. And this publication gives an overview of active learning in practice. It's really important that we think of active learning beginning when children are very young, but we all have a responsibility to make sure that those skills that are learned when children are young and are very young and in nursery are taken into the primary school and indeed carried on to secondary school. So it's really important that regardless what stage in the primary school that you teach, that you're aware of building the curriculum to and active learning in the early years. We need to make sure that we understand how this relates to the 4 capacities and how we can support children's learning as they develop. This document refers to active learning as being learning which engages and challenges children's thinking using real life and imaginary situations. And I think that's a really good definition that we should hold on to as we start to look into active learning in a little bit more depth. You'll hear us continually refer to how good is our school for, and hopefully you've had some chance to start to have some personal reflection in terms of looking at the Level 5 illustration and the features of highly effective practice for Quality Indicator 2.3 Learning, Teaching and Assessment. But the reason I show you this today is to show you how active learning is embedded throughout How Good Is Our School For and the importance of getting this right in our journey of raising attainment and achievement for all of our children. When looking at developing active learners, it's really important that we have a good understanding about the characteristics of child development. Realising the Ambition was published by Education Scotland in February 2020, and that very much looks at the research and evidence that we have and provides national guidance for Scotland in terms of these characteristics of child development. It's entitled Being Me, and I think it's really important that we understand that development of young children, because even from that early age, at the heart of Curriculum for Excellence, we're looking for children to start to build on the skills to become confident in the 4 capacities. So to be successful learners, confident individuals, responsible citizens and effective contributors. When considering early years experiences and developing active learners from that very, very young age, you see the importance of the 7 principles being at the heart of curriculum design, because this reflects and recognises the lifelong nature of education and learning. ensuring from that very early age that children are engaged and interested and connected with their learning in real life contexts so that we can build on this as they journey into the primary school. So we know that Curriculum for Excellence is about putting the child at the centre, and that is really, really important to make sure that we help children to develop. We need to make sure our classrooms promote confidence, creativity and curiosity, that children are allowed to make mistakes, that they're allowed to ask questions and wonder about things in a really well thought out, well designed, well planned learning environment. It's about building on learning and building on practice and equipping children with the right skills that they need for their future. Active learning is focusing on the how pupils learn and not just on the what they learn. I know when I was at school, it was about acquisition of knowledge and cramming for tests and trying to remember lots of facts that you don't remember, not 5 minutes later, never mind, 5 years later. This is about the skills that children are learning and learning how to learn. So it's about combining that knowledge that we do need, but also with that understanding and that development of skills that children are going to need as they progress through school and in later life. So that key to making a curriculum for excellence happen is active learning, because active learning and your classroom promoting active learning and active learners is the how to really supporting our children to thrive and develop in the 4 capacities. If you think about a busy nursery setting, children are busy, they're doing, they're happy, they're enjoying themselves, because children learn best by doing, by thinking and by exploring. Children are naturally inquisitive and ask questions, and we need to build on that and tap into that. So we need children to make their own meaning rather than telling them and presenting things to them. Dylan William observes, nobody ever learned to play guitar by watching someone else play. You need to learn by doing and being actively involved and engaged in the learning process. So you can watch as many times as you like, but without actually doing it, you're not going to progress. Research has shown that more children become active and challenged in their learning, have a better ability to recall and apply that learning. And I think our classrooms across all of our local authorities have become much more active, and we do have an emphasis on this because we know this is what's going to really make a difference to our children. Okay, let's have a look now at the learning environment and those key features of active learning that are going to really help children to learn. Active learning is a process that has pupils at the centre. It focuses on how pupils learn, as I've said already, and not what they learn. So it's about encouraging children to think hard rather than passively receive information from you as the teacher. So it's your job to challenge children's thinking. Active learning is based on a theory called constructivism. And that theory of constructivism emphasises that children construct or build their own understanding. It argues that learning is a process of making meaning and that learners develop their existing knowledge and understanding in order to achieve deeper levels of understanding. This means they're more able to analyse, evaluate and synthesise ideas, which leads to achieving higher order skills of Bloom's taxonomy. Skilled teachers, yourselves, make these deeper levels of understanding more possible by providing learning environments, opportunities, interactions, tasks and instructions that foster that key design principle of deep learning. So you'll see some links here. You'll see we're talking about higher order thinking skills, we're talking about interdisciplinary learning, and again it's all about you planning that really good learning environment for your young people. You'll see that we've broken down active learning into active, collaborative and cognitive. So active when children are involved and they're engaged and they're listening and they're taking responsibility. to that deeper learner when they're learning, when they're being collaborative and they're working in teams and they're sharing ideas and they're taking turns, but to where we really want them to be, that cognitive, that thinking about thinking when they're asking questions and they're answering questions and they've got ideas and they're offering possible solutions. And that's the kind of learning environment we want to be creating to make sure our children are really developing in terms of their skills of being an active learner. So we need to think about how, as teachers, we can increase the likelihood of learners becoming more active by giving them lots of opportunities to be engaged in their learning. So ideas like getting them involved in planning experiments, encouraging them to ask questions. Children naturally, when they're very young, and those of you who have children, and especially at that age of 2 and 3, will know that children ask the who, the whats, the wheres, the whys, and that drive us really mad in terms of constantly asking questions. But where does that all go? Because as children come into school, traditionally in primary 4, 5, 6 and 7, that becomes less and less and less. Children are more reluctant to ask questions. So we need to think about the kind of experiences that we have in our classrooms and that we're encouraging children to ask questions, to explain their thinking, their reasoning, and making sure they're really engaged and enjoying what they're doing. I know that you'll all be very aware of this, that idea of using thinking routines, but this really is about developing active learners. So take some time to consider these 7 thinking routines. Have a look at them if you're not aware of them already, and try to make sure they're embedded into your practice, because these are really good ways of giving children that ownership of their learning, that involvement in learning, which will give them the skills that we're looking for. It wouldn't be IOC if we didn't think about the impact. And here you can very clearly see the impact of active learning in terms of average retention rates. So if you look at the bottom of the triangle there, when we're talking about group discussions, practice and teaching others, when children are participating in terms of teaching methods, that active learning, that the recall retention rates are much, much higher. So this shows that if children are actively involved in their learning, you're going to get a much bigger return than if you are standing talking to children and they are passive in their learning. So taking all of this into consideration, we need to think about the benefits of active learning. It helps children become those lifelong learners, as the active learning approach is not only about content, but about process, and it gives children greater involvement and control over their learning in that journey from 3 to 18. Active learning encourages success because it encourages children to be central in their learning, and it prepares them better for higher education and for the world of work. Being able to problem solve and apply knowledge are skills that are required for the world of work. Active learning is also engaging and intellectually exciting, and children will be much more enthusiastic. And society needs young people and people going into the world of work who are flexible, creative and proactive. People who can solve problems, make decisions, think critically and communicate effectively and work efficiently within teams and groups. Active learning really highlights the importance for the creativity skills. Those 4 important skills of curiosity, open-mindedness, imagination and problem solving. And Ailsa will take you through that in webinar 9 when she starts to look at the creative classroom, which links beautifully with the concepts we've discussed today on active learning. So now it's time for you to go back to your classroom and reflect on how active your classroom is. Are the children given opportunities to engage and be involved in their learning? And if not, maybe this is something that you want to consider improving for your case study of improvement. I'm going to hand you over to Ailsa now, and she's going to take you through reviewing and connecting the learning. But before I do so, I just want you to have a little bit of reflection on this quote. Creativity requires the courage to let go of certainties. IOC is about you really becoming self-reflective and making the changes in your practice that you know will make you a highly effective teacher and impact on the young people that are in your class.
Thank you, Louise. We're going to think now about the importance of providing opportunities for children to make connections and to continually review and recall their learning as a key part of the learning process. Connecting and reviewing the learning is very closely linked with other features of highly effective practice, which are addressed in future webinars, so it's something that we will keep referring back to in order to make those links. But today we'll look at this in two sections, starting with connecting the learning and then looking at review and recall. So we know that making connections is fundamental to all learning. It's one of the most influential factors in learning. Learning is an active and constructive process where new information is linked to prior knowledge. So it's about making connections to what we already know and what we would like to know, or the new information that we're being presented with. So in order to teach effectively, not only do we need to plan learning based on our understanding of children's prior knowledge, experiences and interests, but we need to provide opportunities for our learners to activate that prior knowledge and make those really important connections themselves. By connecting the learning, we mean making links to what children already know. It is absolutely essential that we make connections with children's prior learning at the beginning of lessons or new blocks of learning in order to build on concepts that children are familiar with. So this means starting the lesson with a child-centered and engaging activity in which all learners can actively participate. This will result in increased confidence as the children are able to demonstrate what they already know, and in turn this will promote engagement and increase learners' motivation for the new area of learning which is to come. Making connections will also help learners to understand the relevance of the learning. So linking back to one of the 7 design principles outlined in Building the Curriculum 3. If children can make connections to prior experiences, learning and interests, then they are much more likely to see the learning as relevant to them. And again, this is promoting engagement and motivation for learning. So using lesson starters to engage learners from the very beginning of a lesson with a stimulating activity which is pupil-centered and involves a high level of participation is one way that we can ensure that learners are getting the opportunity to connect the learning at the beginning of a lesson. So what makes an effective lesson starter? Well, here are some points to consider. So first of all, know what you want to achieve from the lesson starter from the very beginning. So be clear about the purpose of the starter. Is it to recall knowledge from a previous lesson, or are you introducing a new context and you want to spark the children's interest by finding out what they already know or have experienced and what they want to find out? Share this purpose with the children. Explain how the starter connects the learning to a previous lesson or to a new area of learning. Really important that the activity excites the children and activates their interest and is something which requires active engagement, active participation, and I can link back here to what Louise spoke about earlier in that it's something which really gets them thinking and engaged in their learning, not necessarily actively moving around the room. It also should be a short activity, so ideally no more than 10 minutes. And if possible, ready for the learners to begin straight away when they come into the environment. So not something that requires a lengthy introduction or explanation, but just something that they can get stuck into straight away. It's also important to allow time for learners to feed back on responses to the activity, and if there are answers to the starter, important that these are shared with the children before moving on to the main body of the lesson. And we do have a presentation with further information on lesson starters with some examples, particularly for literacy and numeracy, for you to have a look at as part of your journal next week. Okay, so moving on now to think about review and recall. Review and recall is when time is taken to think about main learning points in a lesson and what has been achieved. Learners should be actively engaged in this process in order to encourage learner reflection, enhance understanding, to make connections, and also to determine next steps in learning. And again, linking back to what Louise has said about active learning, this should not be a passive experience for the child where feedback is only one way coming from the teacher. It's also an opportunity for the teacher to gather feedback from the children and to identify and address any misconceptions or misunderstandings, and therefore helps you as the teacher to inform future learning opportunities. So really key that the children are involved actively within this process. And that really is highlighted within the Building the Curriculum 5 document. So we know that learners do well when they're engaging fully in their learning, collaborating, planning and shaping and reviewing their progress. And children can develop their confidence through thinking about and reflecting on their own learning, and they should have regular time to talk about their work and to identify and reflect on the evidence of their progress and their next steps. So we do need to give learners opportunities to talk about what they've learned, the purpose of their learning, to give examples of how they've been successful, to reflect on how they might apply their learning in other areas, and to be involved in identifying next steps. And this involves, for example, teacher-pupil dialogue, as well as learners engaging in self and peer assessment. And both of these we will look at more closely in future webinars. And the same message is reinforced in Hagios 4 within the Level 5 illustrations and features of highly effective practice. And the standard being that all children should have regular opportunities to talk about and review their learning with an adult who knows them well, and to be involved in setting those appropriate next steps. So actively engaged in reviewing their learning, but also looking a bit wider than that and reviewing the work of the school, and also empowering children and young people to have a say in the quality of their learning experiences, and how they learn and how that could be improved. So this graph really helps us to understand why connecting the learning and continual opportunities for review and recall are particularly important. And what you can see here is the theory of primacy and recency effect. So the theory is that if we are presented with a list of items, we will remember best what we hear and see first. Then the middle sort of blurs together, and then again we remember well what comes at the end of the list. And this theory has been applied to learning. So in learning, the primacy effect means that we remember best what we learnt at the beginning of a lesson. And the recency effect means we are again likely to remember well what happened at the end of the lesson. And the shape of this graph shows us what can happen to children's learning at these different points within a lesson. So at the beginning, children are usually engaged and ready to learn, but if the lesson is not stimulating or varied enough, then learning can quickly decrease and stay at that very low level. And then what happens is towards the end of a lesson, children become more alert again and more ready to retain the learning. So we end up with this sort of dip in the middle. So we need to consider a couple of things. Firstly, how can we avoid this dip in the middle? And secondly, how can we make the most of these two prime times for learning and retaining information which occur at the beginning and at the end of a lesson? So now we're going to ask you to think about this, and we'll discuss it more when we go back into teams in just a moment. But considering today's input as well as other features of highly effective practice that have been covered in previous webinars, how can we avoid this dip in the middle for learners? How can we ensure that they are actively engaged in their learning and the focus is kept on the key learning points throughout the lesson? When should we be providing opportunities for review and recall? What strategies and approaches can we use to facilitate this in the classroom? And we'll discuss all of these things back in teams. And just to finish off today's webinar, I'd like you to consider this. If you have told a child 1,000 times and he still does not understand, then it is not the child who is the slow learner. Think about the improvement research about highly effective practice which has been presented to you over the course so far, and reflect on the questions you can see there. Are you a highly effective teacher making a difference? Are you challenging your own thinking and engaging in true self-evaluation in order to identify something that you need to focus on in your classroom, which is going to make a real difference for learners? This self-evaluation process, along with the interpretation of your class data, will really help to inform the focus for your IOC case study of improvement. Just a quick reminder, if you do use Twitter, to please share your thought of the day for webinar 5 using the hashtag there. And we'll return to Teams now for the post-webinar discussion. Thank you.